Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 77 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. The curtain rises on the living room of the modest home of a local doctor in a coastal town in southern Norway. The town is becoming famous for the recuperative waters of its newly founded spa. The doctor serves as the spa's medical officer, in which capacity he's made a troubling discovery, which he feels bound to bring to public attention. But his disclosure will not be welcomed by those in charge, who will not only threaten his employment and the security of his family, but he will soon find himself pitted against the town at large, including his own brother, who is also the town mayor. Far from making him the hero he expected, the doctor's principled stand will make him an enemy of the people. This is Henrik Ibsen's An Enemy of the People, a fable of truth and lies, politics and power, and the challenge and costs of pursuing an unpopular crusade to speak truth to power. It's a story of fake news, manipulation of the media, the dangers of populism, and the environmental cost of capitalism. No wonder it strikes a chord in our time. For as we record this episode, there are two major new productions of An Enemy of the People on the world stage. Here in London, German director Thomas Ostermeyer brings his striking contemporary adaptation to the West End, with Matt Smith starring as the crusading doctor. And in New York, Jeremy Strong, famous as Kendall Roy in the TV series Succession, takes on the role in a version by American playwright Amy Herzog. I've been lucky enough to see the London show, but I have to say I would also love to see Jeremy Strong bring his trademark intensity to the impassioned character of Dr. Stockman. I know that my guest today has also seen the London production because we were actually at the same matinee performance last weekend. So I'm delighted to welcome back to the podcast our resident Ibsen expert, Professor Kirsten Shepherd-Barr. I was privileged to talk with Kirsten only 2 episodes ago when we discussed Ibsen's wonderful play Ghosts, which has also just been on stage here in London. So Kirsten, what is it about Ibsen these days that he's proving so popular?
Well, that's a great question, Douglas. Thank you so much for having me back on the podcast, by the way. It is a really fascinating moment for Ibsen. One of the things that you might notice about these productions, both the one in New York and London, is that they're adaptations. They're not, word for word productions of the actual text. They really do cut a lot. They conflate characters. They're very free flowing in that respect. And it sort of signals, I think, a moment when you get more of these kinds of adaptations and directors' visions, perhaps, than faithful revivals. I mean, we just saw Ghosts, which is a very faithful revival, having said that, but these 2 Enemy of the People productions are striking for that sense in which the ownership passes, or it starts to be kind of divided between the director and Ibsen. And I think that's a healthy thing. It'd be nice if we can have it all and have, as with Shakespeare, lots of revivals as well as lots of new versions. And maybe that's what we'll see more and more of.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's something obviously that does chime with our time and our interests, but they feel like they need to frame it in new language, more modern language, but also with very specific references to our current time as well, so that they can draw the connection, I suppose, from the original.
Yeah, I suppose you could say, well, look at Arthur Miller's adaptation of Enemy of the People. That was perfect for his time. So, that's a bit of evidence, I think, that Ibsen is so adaptable to a variety of different circumstances. As a colleague of mine once said, he's perennially hip.
Oh, well, wouldn't we all love to be perennially hip? You mentioned Arthur Miller, actually, and his adaptation. I did read a little bit about it, but don't know a lot. So just in very few words, what did he do with it?
Well, I mean, in very few words, he basically took An Enemy of the People and made it a parable of the House Un-American Activities Committee, Joseph McCarthy hearings in the 1950s. And so it was very much mapped directly onto that context.
As he did with The Crucible.
Yes, I think that was the whole idea, is that it was about that particular context of pursuing people who were essentially truth tellers
It's quite an interesting footnote. Before we go any further, for those who've not listened to our recent episode on ghosts with Kirsten, I should just give her a proper introduction. Kirsten is professor of English and Theatre Studies at St. Catherine's College, Oxford University. Her first published book was Ibsen and Early Modernist Theatre, 1890 to 1900, and she's written several more books on modern drama, as well as numerous contributions to journals and critical collections. She's been a guest on Melvin Bragg's In Our Time on Radio 4 on the episode devoted to Ibsen, and has acted as a consultant on productions at a number of theaters, including for the recent production of Ghosts at the Globe. It seemed especially apt to follow up our conversation about ghosts, Kirsten, with this episode on An Enemy of the People, because it was the very next play that Ibsen wrote straight after Ghosts in 1882. And I believe that in some ways he wrote An Enemy of the People as a response to the hostile reaction that Ghost met with when it was published. So again, for those who haven't listened yet to our conversation about Ghost, could you tell us a bit about the trouble that Ghost caused? And then in what ways was his writing of this play a response to Ghost's reception?
Yeah, that is actually the standard narrative of the way in which An Enemy of the People unfolded. However, so Ghost caused this absolute outrage. People say that perhaps Ibsen miscalculated his audience, and he thought that people would be perhaps more tolerant than they were. But it's not true that he actually, wrote Enemy of the People as a response directly to that response to Ghost, because in fact, he had begun Enemy of the People after A Doll's House. And he set it aside to write what became Ghosts when he was inspired by the publication by Alexander Kielland of what was called the syphilitic novel. And there was this kind of outcry and interest in this subject matter. And Ibsen felt compelled. He actually said this was really forced upon him. He was so compelled to write a play that dealt with syphilis and really used it as a metaphor for wider issues and ideas. And then he writes Enemy of the People once Ghost is out of system. But already before Ghost was published, he writes to his publisher and says, I'm at work on a new comedy. And in Scandinavian context, comedy doesn't necessarily mean something comedic. It can often just be used as a sort of shorthand for a drama, at that time at least. And yet he did insist, he says he's interested in striking a light tone in this next play. He says, quote, it will be a very peaceable play this time, one which may safely be read by the state councillors and the merchants and their ladies, and the theatres will not have to recoil in horror from it.
Which they did to Ghosts, right? Just remind us a little bit about how Ghost was received.
Well, I think they had published 10,000 copies, just assuming that, as before, Ibsen's plays would sell well. And he was shocked. I think he was really not prepared for the fact that it was such a vilified drama, and the booksellers returned copies and so on. So it was a jolt for him to have that kind of response. But that's key, because what happens to Ibsen is, with An Enemy of the People, he repositions himself with regard to the sort of literary left. And I think this is something that's vital for understanding himself in relation to the most avant-garde writers of the time. And so he starts to be more of an outsider, not really belonging to that group any longer, the group that just a few years earlier he had very much been a part of. And so that's really key. Do you see how he's starting to see himself more as the outsider? And they start to distance themselves from him as well. So that explains a lot of what is there in Enemy of the People in terms of Stockman as kind of truth teller in relation to some of these people who he feels compromise themselves and their morals in order to gain something from the situation.
Yeah, so a number of the theaters in Scandinavia in particular refused to put Ghosts on initially. And he was particularly upset or surprised even by the reaction of what he assumed was the liberal press, who took against it. There was one left-wing paper that described it as the most unpleasant book we have read for a long time, and that silence, in our opinion, would be the most fitting reception for such a work. And another said the book has no place on the Christmas table of any Christian home, the play being published in December to maximize sales, which he would normally do at Christmas. So Ibsen, I think, was taking some aim at the liberal press and had expected better of them, I guess. As he said, what is one to say of the attitude taken by the so-called liberal press? These leaders who talk and write of freedom and progress, and at the same time let themselves be the slaves of the supposed opinions of their subscribers. I was going to say, though, that am I right to suggest that An Enemy of the People is less frequently performed than some of Ibsen's other major plays today? I mean, plays such as Ghost, A Doll's House, Hedda Gabler, they seem to be done more now. Why do you think that may be the case?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, it's sort of anecdotal, isn't it? The sense that we have that Enemy of the People isn't as frequently performed. But I think that hunch can be backed up because one of the things that's difficult about Enemy of the People, for one thing, it's not overtly a feminist drama. And the ones you mentioned, of course, have this incredible relevance to many contexts today where feminism is still being fought and is very much a hot issue. Or Enemy of the People, we need to talk about how it's actually, in a way, a problem play. And I'm sort of deliberately adopting Shakespearean language there.
Oh, I like it.
Because, I mean, I find it so uncomfortable myself because, and this might explain why the thing I mentioned has been happening where directors take it and shake it up, strip out some of the text, radically change it. Because the play reflects a moment when Ibsen is seriously espousing some pretty upsetting, difficult ideas that he then rejects later on. And what I'm talking about really is a kind of eugenic thinking. So the text contains uncomfortable references to Stockman talking about the people in the North, where he was a doctor for a while, as vermin, and curs is how they're often translated. I mean, really objectionable language about human beings as being virtually animals. So Ibsen had read his Darwin, he had read other evolutionary thinkers, and he was sort of churning all these ideas, I think, around in his head. But it comes out in Enemy of the People as a pretty distasteful set of ideas about human beings. And this is, of course, the moment when Galton coins this term eugenics in 1883. Ibsen's already kind of mooted some of these ideas in his play Enemy of the People. And as I say, he does go on to, he moves away from this kind of thinking. It's just a brief period in his evolution, if you will, but it's there. And I don't think we can look away. And Ibsen, I think, deliberately puts elements that are objectionable into Stockman's character because he nuances him. He makes him a complicated character. He's not just a cardboard cutout in any way. And although he often is seen to, and Ibsen himself said this, be the closest representation of Ibsen himself in all the plays, still, there's a way in which Ibsen is also, while he's sort of self-parodying, he's also saying, let's take a hard look at these kinds of people, what makes them tick. So, for instance, another thing about Stockman is he's absolutely great at essentially manipulating the women around him to do all his hard work for him.
Yeah.
As a colleague put it in a wonderful book published recently, commanding female labor so that he can go out and do his fighting for the truth. And this applies to his wife and very glaringly to the maid whose name he cannot remember. And he puts many references to this in the play so that we get the picture, right? That Stockman is all about the truth and high-minded ideas, but it's not worth his while to remember the name of the serving girl. So these are little, very typical Ibsen moments and gestures that are very powerful. They say a lot.
Yeah, you're right. You've just identified a number of the problems in a problem play. Primarily, there's the element of Stockman expressing what we think are pretty unpalatable ideas these days, and as you say, often may even get stripped out or watered down. But they shouldn't be, because it is about the complexity of this character. But it's interesting, isn't it, that it's also, in some ways, I suppose, a more conventional play, more political one than a psychological drama in the way that the others that I mentioned are. And they're actually surprisingly modern and potentially more universal than some of the political ideas that may not endure.
Well, I wanted to mention, while you say modern, one of the elements that people sometimes miss about Enemy of the People is that it's actually, in many ways, a kind of proto-environmentalist play.
Yes.
Because the reason the baths are polluted in the first place turns out to be that there's a tannery upstream, and there's all this contaminated water running straight into the spa waters. And in Ibsen's world, everyone's all closely connected. Lo and behold, it's Stockman's own father-in-law who runs the tanneries. And so there's this complicated way in which you see the economic stakes. You don't see the tanneries, you just see the people who represent them, the father-in-law, but they're talked about. It's a really powerful sense that there's a presence of environmental contamination. And to me, this makes the play really modern and very much speaking to our time.
It definitely does. Let's go through a plot summary as briefly as we can and introduce the main characters. As you say, and I said at the beginning, the local spa, he's discovered that the water is poisoned and he wants to make that public and proposes that the baths be closed and alterations made to make it safe. But this provokes a strong response from those with vested interests. His brother, who is the mayor and also on the board of the spa institution, and others, his father-in-law, as you mentioned, who do not want the source of the poison to be revealed. And all of them have an economic interest in maintaining the spa because it's the livelihood of the town. And the reputation of the spa would be irreparably damaged if this sort of news came out, even if they did take steps, which they say would take 2 years to rectify the situation. And so then the doctor, Stockman, is threatened by his own brother with dismissal from his job as the medical officer. His wife counsels him not to offend them even and lose his job. He then proposes to write an article for the newspaper to make the news public. And initially, the paper's editor and printer support him. But when the mayor makes it clear that actually it's the town taxpayers who will be liable to pay for repairs to the spa, then the publishers decide that actually this would be too unpalatable for their readership who won't want to pay for it. So they actually backtrack and withdraw their support for Stockman and publicizing the truth. So he decides he'll hold a public meeting to try and tell the story directly to the people. But that meeting is hijacked by his opponents and they forbid him saying anything about the spa. At which point he's provoked into a general diatribe, a tirade against the powers that be and even the general public. And this is where he expresses some of these questionable ideas and where he is declared an enemy of the people. And the attack on him swells, where people throw stones at his house, break the windows. His landlord evicts him. His daughter is dismissed from her job as a teacher. He's dismissed from his job with the spa. He's going to lose patients in his medical practice. They're basically being hounded out of town. And as you said, there is his father-in-law who owns the local tannery, but also is quite well off and has indicated to Stockman and his wife that they can expect to inherit from him for his grandchildren. They have 3 children, I think it is. But he buys up shares in the spa at a depressed price because of these rumors going around. And then he says, this is your inheritance, these shares, which adds an extra twist because, of course, if they are valueless, then he and his family will inherit nothing. So his father-in-law, in a sense, blackmails him or attempts to say, if you withdraw these accusations, then the value of the shares will increase again, of course, to your benefit as well as mine. But of course, the father-in-law is also trying to keep secret the fact that it's his factory that's partly contributing to the poisoning of the waters. Forgive me for taking that on myself. I just rattled through that.
That was great.
Okay. So he's left in this precarious position where he's under attack from all quarters, and there isn't a lot left for him in this town. What does he do? Well, we won't answer that question yet. We'll come to that when we get to the end. But it all starts from his principled stand, I guess you'd say. Now, let's talk a bit about the central character here, Dr. Stockman. And you touched on a couple of things about him, which I wanted to draw out. First was about whether he represents what Ibsen himself thinks and as a character. He wrote, "It's been fun working on this play. Dr. Stockman and I got on most excellently. We agree about so many things, but the doctor has a more muddled head on his shoulders than I have, and has besides certain characteristics which will permit people to tolerate things from his lips which they might not accept so readily had they issued from mine." I wonder whether that refers to his recent experience with ghosts. But how do you think Ibsen identifies with Stockman? Does he see himself as the speaker of truth to power, for example?
It's a really good question. I think there's so many ways you can approach that. It does seem that he was more willing to be associated with Stockman than other characters. He's done a whole string of plays by this point, several plays at least, that feature strong female central characters. And here he has a very strong focus on the male experience, but also that sense in which he is able, if it is himself, and I think it is very much Ibsen doing a bit of self-portraiture, there's still an amazing capacity to look critically at himself as well. There's a bit of vanity to Stockman that Ibsen readily admits. There's a great comic moment when he comes into the newspaper office and he says, oh, I know you're probably planning some kind of celebration and a parade to thank me for my...
A statue in the town square.
Exactly. Oh, don't worry. You don't have to do that. And that is the furthest thing from their minds. But it's just that Ibsen also had this streak of vanity, and he was known for cultivating the rich and famous, even while he probably behind their backs was sneering a bit. But he, for example, got himself some honorary degrees from the King of Sweden, was one of them. He definitely loved to kind of wear these medals and honors. And he'd like to call himself Dr. Ibsen, for example. And so there was that streak, but here he is able to do that self-parody. And I think that says a lot.
Yes, well, he's definitely a flawed character. I found a couple of small details that pointed me in the direction that there is an association between Ibsen and this character. There's a note in the Penguin edition that says that Ibsen himself was called an enemy of society in a debate in the Norwegian Parliament in 1882, presumably in response to ghosts and the doll's house, possibly even. And then, of course, the way he is vilified for publishing the truth, as he would have it, with ghosts. He may say, I am a truth teller like Stockman in that regard. And there are a couple other really wonderful details I picked up. One was that the house where Ibsen was born was called Stockman's Garden.
Yeah, Stockman's gone, yeah.
And then there's another one that in the stage direction in Act 4, Stockman addresses the public meeting that he's wearing a black coat with a white cravat. Now, Robert Ferguson, one of the biographers, said that apparently this is a trademark outfit of Ibsen himself. So he's even painting the picture that he's standing up there at that public meeting.
Yeah, and I think some of the actors who portrayed Stockman purposely did the whole, mutton chop whiskers look to evoke Ibsen himself.
And I understand also that some of the political opinions that Stockman expresses, you've also touched on this, are verbatim almost ones that Ibsen had aired himself with friends. And so there's a serious connection here in terms of some of the political views that he puts in Stockman's mouth.
Yeah, I think it's tricky because what I was referring to before, this moment when he's flirting with eugenicist ideas, for example, one of the things I like about the play a lot is that it shows Stockman is capable of change. So just from Act 4 to 5, for example, Act 4, in that speech, he's very disparaging about the common people. I mentioned the language he uses. It's quite offensive to describe them. But in the ending of the actual text, he turns right around and decides, why don't we start a school for children who are essentially, as one translation puts it, the gutter snipes, the homeless children. And he says, we'll have the school in the very room where they called me an enemy of the people. But there ought to be a few more of us. I must have at least a dozen boys to start with. And of course, doesn't think about the girls. He says, just for once, I'm going to try and experiment on these mongrels. You never know what you might find amongst them. So he's still in the mindset of they're mongrels, they're less than human, but at the same time, he's willing to invest in them. He wants to change and improve the lot of these cast-off children.
Education being the key.
Yeah.
And as you said, he's not an unalloyed hero, is he? He has many good qualities. He's open-hearted and generous, happy to share his home and his food with guests, is clear in the first act. He's visionary, idealistic, fired up by the progressive energies of the young journalists we meet, for example, which you will come to. And he has integrity, of course. He sticks to his principles about the truth against all this pressure. But he's also naive and impractical and blinkered and self-centered, even attention-seeking, as you said. He believes that as soon as the truth is recognized, everyone will do what is right. But he's also somewhat pompous, which Ibsen may also have been.
Yes.
He was honest to himself as well. He comes to think of himself almost as some sort of political prophet, vowing to mount this campaign in the paper to cleanse the whole of society. It's not just the waters he wants to clean. And in the end, when the public turn on him, he likens himself even to Christ. I shall not say, I forgive you, for you know not what you do. So in some ways, he's almost lost touch with reality, becomes a little bit like a madman of sorts. And I also wondered, do you think there are times when he's somewhat ludicrous even? Do you think it goes that far?
Yeah, and one of the things that's so hard to stomach now is the elitism of Stockman. The way in that speech, which I mentioned, he says that he's gagged because he's allowed the platform, but he's not allowed to speak about the baths.
Yes.
So yes, you can get up and speak about anything you like except the thing you really want to talk about. But what he uses the platform for then is to launch this rather unhinged sometimes attack on what he calls the masses or the sort of unthinking majority. And he really entrenches himself in this position of being the minority. The minority is always right, is something he says. The strongest man is he who stands most alone, is another thing he says toward the end of the play. So that idea of being an exception and almost being a visionary, seeing things that the rest of the people can't see. And this language builds up and it creates this sense of him not just fencing himself or barricading himself in, but giving this vibe of being smarter than everyone else and above everyone else. And he talks about this liberal aristocracy. This is his concept. And it's hard to know exactly what he means, but in that particular context, he's being very elitist and very much about this minority of gifted visionary people who should be leading.
One of the translations was spiritually noble individuals.
Yes.
But also it's something to do with intelligence, because he basically refers to the masses as stupid.
Yeah.
And that there are a few intelligent people who should be trusted with governing and power. Let's talk about his brother, the mayor, Peter Stockman. He's essentially the baddie, I think, isn't he? He's another one of the establishment men, it's usually men, who Ibsen loves to take aim at. He obstructs the truth to protect his own position, of course. He uses his platform to manipulate the press, to threaten and smear his own brother. He's self-serving, hypocritical, a classic politician, perhaps, isn't he?
I do think you're absolutely right that he is the baddie of the piece, if there is one. But I think that gets beside, I think Ibsen's point really is that it's about bad forces. It's not bad people. So it's really about what the mayor represents. Do you think? I mean, that sense in which, yes, we can point at Peter Stockman as this, really corrupt individual willing to chuck his own brother under the bus. But that kind of, to me, gets beside the point of what is the play saying that is harder for us to deal with in real life, which is that there are all these forces that accumulate and that are very hard to change in terms of the way politics works, the way economic interests are vested. I mean, these are really hard to make any kind of headway with when they become corrupt and they dominate the way people behave and legislate people's minds.
That's fair. He is a representative of, and you might say victim of, the society in which he operates. And I was struck actually that generally Ibsen choosing to set these plays in these provincial towns, that he's creating a limited scale of a society that he can set out clear representation of what he thinks the big issues in society are, how restrictive the social hierarchies are that apply, and as you say, how power is exercised and vested and very hard to change. And he saw himself, I think, as a progressive thinker, and that the world he knew really did need social change.
I was going to say it was striking what you said about Peter Stockman as almost like a victim of his own circumstance, because that's exactly what people say about Helmer in A Doll's House. So the husband isn't the baddie. It would be beside the point to point the finger at Torvald Helmer, because he's not the problem as much as what has created the outlook that Helmer has. And you could say possibly the same thing, that Ibsen is saying it's really not about these individuals. It's about what has created the circumstances where we keep churning out these ways of thinking. And that's what happens in Ghost too. It's about that speech when she says, oh, why don't these ways of thinking die? Why are there these ghosts that keep haunting us, our old ways of thought?
I was going to say that Peter Stockman seems a very similar character to Pastor Manders in Ghosts. He argues for the status quo of society and that individuals should be subjugated to society as it is. And in fact, Peter Stockman in this play says the individual must be ready to comply with the community as a whole, or more precisely with the authorities whose job it is to watch over the welfare of that community. And I think Pastor Manders has a pretty similar speech in Ghosts, where he's advising Mrs. Alving not to pursue any independent thinking of her own. That way anarchy lies. And as you say, that Helmer in a Doll's House, I directed a production of A Doll's House last year, in fact, and we were at pains to ensure that Helmer wasn't a baddie entirely in that sense personally, that he was a victim of his time. He was a man of his time. I find it a little more difficult to forgive Peter Stockman, the mayor here, or Pastor Manders. And what's interesting about that comparison, of course, is that here's a footnote, is that the recent production of Ghosts that we saw in London.
The same actor.
And then this An Enemy of the People is the same actor, Paul Hilton, who does a brilliant job, by the way, of embodying the slippery, stuck-up self-righteousness of both of those characters.
Absolutely. I mean, yes, those are the two characters that are veering most closely to, the baddie. But one thing I always come back to is Ibsen always said he only took one piece of playwriting advice, and it was, in a good play, everyone is right. And that idea that even such objectionable characters as the pastor in Ghosts and Peter Stockman in Enemy, they believe so strongly in their own rightness. And Ibsen allows us to see their point of view. So there is this almost uncomfortable way in which we can't simply dismiss them. There's something about our capacity to see their point of view, and that's critical. And actually, it's my thinking that maybe part of why these plays withstand the test of time, partly because people talk a lot about the day and age we're in now with social media, with the phenomenon of just laying out your opinion bluntly and in an entrenched way, and that this is why Ibsen's plays resonate when they talk about truth-telling, the idea of having genuine debate where you don't have people simply reduced to throwing stones, like in the end of Enemy. So it's questioning what is the nature of civilized discussion and constructive debate. And this play, of all the plays, really does raise that.
That's true. It does. And of course, Peter Stockman has a point that economically this is a threat to the town and all that that means. And there must be some sympathy, perhaps, for the fact that his brother, the doctor, has always been a bit of a loose cannon, and that Peter has had to look after him in the real world. Fine, but, he's also pretty cruel and self-serving, as we've said. And there's a point of detail which maybe supports the idea that he's a victim in a way, is that he suffers with a poor stomach, which may have something to do with the water he drinks. Ta-da! That may be just me, but I thought that was a lovely detail. And I think it was suggested in the recent production that there's some connection.
Yes, it was.
Anyway, let's move on. What about the doctor's wife, Mrs. Stockman? She has a difficult time living with her idealistic husband, does she not?
Yes, I know. And of course, her job, as he says at one point, is to make sure that he looks good when he goes out to fight for truth and justice. I mean, he does say it in a different way. He says, you shouldn't wear your best trousers when you're going out to defend the truth. But nonetheless, the point is, he doesn't have to worry about what his clothing is because she's got it all ready for him. He's got all of those needs attended to. And that's the woman standing behind the man. And this is a very traditional way of thinking that we see coming out of Stockman. He's blinkered. So he has some ways in which he's ahead of the pack and other ways in which he's absolutely embedded in these old ways of thinking in terms of gender roles.
Yes, absolutely. This was really stressed in the recent production in London because, as you said, they make changes to the setup in the original play. The doctor and his wife in Ostermeyer's adaptation have a young baby rather than a grown-up daughter and two sons in Ibsen's original. And I thought that they used that very effectively to build the characterization of the doctor as too distracted and self-centered to pay practical attention to his family. She is the one literally left holding the baby most of the time.
And there's a wonderful moment when they're sitting opposite each other and they're having a chat, and there's a laundry basket, and the doctor starts to fold the clean clothes, and he's doing such a bad job of it, but he doesn't realize. And he puts them on the table, and she just picks them up and folds them properly and puts them in the basket. And this is almost a fluid movement between them. The audience is obviously clocking that perfectly, and it's so nicely done.
Yeah, and of course, she is far more pragmatic and realistic than he, the idealist. She's determined to protect their financial position, where he is not paying enough attention to the realities of that and what the implications will be of what he does. But we'll also come to what her position is at the end of the play in terms of her loyalty to him, given that she recognizes the dangers they're in practical terms. What does she think about how far he should maintain this principled stand? Let's not answer that quite yet, because I want to do that when we get to the end, if we can, Kirsten. Let's talk a bit about the journalists on the local newspaper. Stockman initially views the newspaper as a beacon of truth and progress in this traditional town, I'd say. He refers to them even as bold, enterprising young people, liberal-minded people, full of purpose. But they don't turn out to be quite so honorable, do they? It's as a representation, again, maybe of what Ibsen thought of the media in response to their response to ghosts. These characters, Hofstadt and Billing, who are journalists. What do you make of his treatment of them and their behavior?
I think he had it in for the newspapers, really. I mean, he was pretty shocked at his own treatment, I think, and how quickly supporters could fall away if their own positions were threatened. So the fickleness in his view of the press, and he also hated, I think, the fact that he was at its mercy. So, for example, to get good reviews, that mattered a lot. And of course, not just reviews of productions, but also of his published books.
Sales of the books were really important to him as a source of income.
Yes, they did pretty much even out, which is interesting. So he did as well with the sales of the book as with the theater rights. He did well financially. He was a prosperous man.
But yeah, the word fickleness is really apt, I think, in terms of the presentation of what happens with these local journalists, is that they appear to be committed to a socialist political agenda to challenge the establishment, speak up for the little people. And in fact, they say it's their aim to sweep away the establishment powers and the whole feudal elite will come tumbling down. Clear the swamp, as it says. As I think that's a translation of the original. It's impossible not to hear echoes of a certain Mr. Trump's mantra about clearing out the Washington swamp in that, albeit this is a left-wing cry. Although I think it's one of Ibsen's points is to pronounce a plague on both political houses, isn't it? Liberal and conservative?
Yes, it is. And I think that's where he may have confused people as well about his own stance. People maybe didn't understand exactly what did he ally himself with? Where did he stand? So he had a very deep connection to these brothers called Georg and Edvard Brandes in Denmark, who were the great radical writers of their time. And Georg Brandes comes up a lot in discussions of Ibsen. And Ibsen absolutely embraces the ideas that Brandes is calling for. And one of his ideas is that contemporary literature should submit problems to debate, contemporary problems. And you can see this right through Ibsen's writing. He goes on to write a string of social problem plays, and they are dealing with the woman question, the polluted baths, the outdated ideas, syphilis. I mean, just one after the other. So rather than getting him glowing, unequivocal praise from all quarters, he's really hotly debated, and he's, I think, quite surprised by some of the response from the very people he thought would be his supporters. And it had to do with this problem of people's vested interests, people fearing for their livelihood if they were to come to his support, and so on. And it's complicated because, for example, Edvard Brandes was a member of parliament, a liberal member, and he took the play Enemy of the People to be essentially a kind of attack on the principle of majority rule. This is very public. People are aware of this. You know, sometimes some of the things we quote from Ibsen's letters, they're just private things that he's saying to colleagues. They're not being aired publicly. But this stuff is right out there. It's in the open, and everyone's following it. And so I think his vilification of the side switching, the people who, for their own protection, switch sides, this was something he really attacks in the play.
Yes, another figure who's in his sights is the printer, Aslaksen, who's a small businessman keen to protect the spa to ensure the local economy flourishes. But he's also head of the local homeowners association, so part of the property owning establishment. And in fact, I read that only property owners could vote in Norway at the time. So he is influential and certainly invested in the status quo in that regard. And Ibsen sets up a world, I think, where conservatives are aligned against those with more progressive ideas. The journalists initially and Aslaksen claim that they have these progressive ideas. But as you say, when it comes to it, their personal interests overwhelm these political principles that they have. And Aslaksen is very much one of the representatives of the status quo, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting that in the production by Ostermeyer that's on in London right now, Aslaksen is the one who's putting the mic in front of all the audience members saying, tell us your views. Tell us what you think.
Well, also they changed him to her, but they changed him to be the proprietor of the newspaper who would make
Yes.
editorial choices, whereas in Ibsen's original, he's the printer of the paper. And in the London adaptation, that gives him or her more power to determine what goes in the newspaper and its political stance, of course, which, again, they compromise, as we said at the beginning. They won't print Stockman's letter or article about the waters at the spa because they don't want to upset their subscribers.
Exactly.
And I mean, it seems pretty obvious to us now that the commercial reality would rule the media in that way.
Yeah.
You talked about the environmental theme, which is certainly clear. And I couldn't help but think of the water companies that are currently dumping sewage into the rivers and the sea around the UK. And generally is the reality of climate change, the challenge that's displayed here of accepting the financial costs required to address it. That's basically what's happening in this small town, isn't it?
It is.
Another one of the central themes of the plays is about the simple difference between truth and lies. And I mentioned at the beginning that this is a theme that's familiar to us in the age of fake news or alternative facts. And that's also what's going on here, isn't it? Because there is truth, and then there's the spinning of an alternative fact in the mayor's interpretation or presentation of the situation.
Well, it's interesting because did you get the impression that they were denying that it actually was true what he had found? Because my sense of it was people weren't really challenging what he had found because it is biologically proven by him having sent samples to an external laboratory. But so what they're refuting is, well, they're not even refuting. They're saying, okay, how do we manage this truth?
Well, there is that. There is something I think Peter Stockman says, I don't think I agree with your interpretation or something along those lines, as if this truth could be interpreted.
Yes.
But you're right. It's mainly about how those in power manipulate public opinion to promote or protect themselves by obscuring or denying the facts, by the alternative stories they create, personal attacks, for example. You know, he is personally vilified. His reputation is undermined, and therefore he doesn't even get a chance to present the facts. And as you mentioned earlier, it's interesting, you think about social media, how that enhances the capacity to broadcast one way or the other. In the age when Ibsen first wrote it, the mayor has to issue a statement in the newspaper, as does the doctor, and then the doctor has to go to a public meeting to try and speak to the public. But now anybody could reach a much wider audience very rapidly. You know, the proliferation of views aired on social media and the echo chambers in which we consume them leads to higher distrust of anything that we're presented. And it's very easy to imagine in our age that Dr. Stockman would not be believed, that these facts would not be recognized, and he would just be attacked.
I suppose you could even say, would we have heard at all? There could have been a complete shutting down before it got out. This is the interesting thing, is this play doesn't have any modern mechanisms of dissemination in it. It just has the newspaper. And yet it's so electrifying to see the behind the scenes shutting down of this important voice. And imagine now, obviously that would be a lot harder because things could just get put out there in a second. But all the more potent are the powers that can instantly shut something down and cause something not to be known. And that's quite a paradox, and it's really worrying. So there's a lot of food for thought about how we disseminate information of this kind.
Well, there's fewer gatekeepers now, so that those who want to put out falsehoods or fake news can do so pretty easily, right? Without having to prove something to the newspaper to get it published. I mean, of course, we view Stockman, and Ibsen did as well, as the spokesperson for truth. But it's also an age-old battle, isn't it, between truth and power? As Mrs. Stockman herself says, what use is it to have right on your side when you have no power? And the story becomes one of an individual standing up against all of the powers, the institutions, the majority. He also is, in fact, a whistleblower, isn't he? Because, as his brother reminds him, he's an employee of the spa. And the position of a whistleblower is a fascinating one, isn't it? As to whether, you know, are they being disloyal or acting even illegally, given the terms of their employment, for example? There's certainly a huge risk for whistleblowers in speaking out, as we know.
Yeah. There's an old adage, nobody likes a whistleblower. And
But, you know, but there's truth there.
yeah.
There was a drama on television last week about the NHS during the pandemic called Breathtaking, and it's based on a doctor's real-life account of what it was like at the sharp end in the A&E in our hospitals during the worst of the COVID crisis. And at one point, the medical staff become aware that there are people spreading fake news that COVID is a conspiracy and the hospitals are in fact empty, when in reality they're overflowing with cases and there aren't enough beds or equipment and all the rest. And the doctor believes that she must tell the public the truth, but she is warned, of course, that she'll be speaking out against the government, NHS England, who are her employer, and not authorized to do so, and she risks therefore being struck off. So it's her against institutional power, and they will legally prosecute her. She'll be struck off. What price are we willing to risk or pay on a matter of principle such as that, when all those powers are arrayed against you?
Yeah, and actually, it might be worth mentioning at this point that Ibsen constantly stayed essentially a step ahead of his audiences by rethinking the very thing he had just seemed passionately to be defending. So, for example, with The Wild Duck, that was the next play after Enemy of the People. So 1884, he turns right around and does essentially a kind of satire of himself. So The Wild Duck is all about the complete devastation wrought by a truth teller. So this character who comes into a family and essentially says, oh, you guys are living a lie. This isn't actually your daughter. This is an illegitimate child. And all hell breaks loose. And there's a deep tragedy. And Ibsen is seeming to say, what was the point of having the truth come out about this relationship? Now, the difference, of course, is in The Wild Duck, it's all within a family. It's a private matter. And what we're talking about with Enemy is this is deeply imbricated in all kinds of public, political, social systems. And so these are not level playing fields in that sense, these two plays. But nonetheless, there's the turning right around and questioning of something that he seemed to be portraying as a vital question for our time is, what about telling the truth?
Yeah. I mean, well, it isn't, as we've touched on previously, it isn't that simple when it comes to the public meeting, for example, where Stockman gets up on his feet and the speeches he makes. The things he outlines there are quite a convoluted, controversial political ideology, which includes disdain, as we've said, for the capacities of the common people and the dangers of democracy even. I think it's safe to say that he gets pretty carried away and may not help his own cause. So what are we to make of this soapbox performance of sorts? Is he a truth teller or a crackpot?
I think he's a naive truth teller who has some idea that truth will just win out in the end and all of those other forces will be defeated by its magnificence. But in fact, the situation is so complicated by people's interests and livelihoods and so on. And actually, at the end of the play, he says to his wife, come over here, Catherine, look how beautifully the sun is shining in here today, and this glorious fresh spring air that's been let in. And his wife says, if only we could live on sun and fresh air, Thomas. She's absolutely got her feet on the ground. She's the one, and this is really the crux, Douglas, I think, is that he's a man who's fighting for the truth. And this is something that cannot be reiterated enough, I think, with this play. It's very different because Stockman has the luxury of being able to focus entirely on this issue of getting this truth out and so on. He doesn't have to make the kind of little practical decisions and compromises for his family that are happening all the time behind his back in the real world of the women. And so his wife is simply saying, I don't even know how sarcastically you would have to express this as the actress because it's there in the text, if only we could live on sun and fresh air. She's saying we have to think practically. She's not necessarily saying we have to compromise our ethics, but she's getting at the heart of the problem of the imbalance between them as men and women. She doesn't have that luxury to think in these idealistic ways that he does.
Yes. Well, fascinating you refer to this because we just talk about where you think it leaves them at the end then. Dr. Stockman's wife assumes that they will leave town, I think, initially, given that they have lost everything, their jobs. His sons have actually been expelled from the school. Everyone's turned against them. But he decides they're going to stay and continue to fight the battle. He will teach his sons himself and the other children from the street, potentially, that he'll mold them into future warriors of truth in some way, I guess. And as the curtain folds, he cries that he's the strongest of all because it's he who stands alone, most alone. He's not even alone. That's an interesting irony, of course. He's standing with his wife and family at this point.
Yeah.
Another indication of his egoism, I suppose, that he barely acknowledges their existence or their essential support, as you've rightly described. But the real question was, what does his wife think about this stance? Where does she think they're going? I think there's a stage direction that she smiles and shakes her head or something like, he's a hopeless dreamer, but are we really sticking to this? I wanted to ask you because it's really interesting that the two current productions that I mentioned at the start in London, New York, choose to end the play, I think, with a more equivocal interpretation of the doctor's intentions. As I read the text, Stockman is sticking to his guns, without question.
Yeah.
And in Thomas Ostermeyer's ending in London, there's a suggestion in the way that Stockman and his wife look at each other at the last moment that they might seriously consider compromising, taking the shares in the spa that her father has offered that I mentioned earlier, which would mean he's modifying his stance somehow so that the value of the shares will recover. It's just a look that he gives her and vice versa, I think. And I don't know whether I've even misinterpreted that.
No, I agree that that's there.
And then according to a preview piece in the New York Times I read, Amy Herzog has also softened Stockman's stance at the end, replacing his defiant cry that he will stand alone with a vague hope that the truth will prevail. The lines she's using in her adaptation were, we just have to imagine that the water will be clean and safe and the truth will be valued. We just have to imagine. Herzog's quoted as saying that Stockman's crusading confidence didn't resonate with her at all. So, why do you think that these modern writers feel that it'd be more appropriate to dilute Stockman's conviction if that's what they're doing?
Well, I read that same piece about Amy Herzog, who's a brilliant playwright, and she says several times in that interview, I see things that are in the play that I want to change. I think she says, but more importantly, there are things that aren't in there that I feel should be. I'm not giving the exact flavor. She said it much better herself, but it was that sense in which that this play needs still to have a lot of work done to it, to bring it into some kind of shape that may be more in line with our thinking or our situations, or perhaps our less clear way out of a mess like this. I mean, it's a mess. In the end, you have to imagine in the original text, we're left with no doubt that he is being driven out of town if they can possibly get him to leave. He's barricaded himself with his family. There are stones going past their ears. I mean, it's really dire. And why would this playwright who left us at the end of Ghosts with no doubt that the mother has to make a choice to either help her child die or not, the impossible choice, and he doesn't tell us what it's going to be, why would he leave us with some watered down ending for this play? He's a brilliant play ender. So I think that this is what both Ostermeyer and Herzog are grappling with, is a sense that it doesn't seem to work for them that this ending should really be so harsh, and that he should stick to his guns so completely, and even more so. He's become even more entrenched in his belief in himself rather than sort of rattled. And there's a brilliant moment I absolutely love. This makes me laugh out loud, this moment when he's with his family. It's the last seconds of the play. He drops his voice and he says, "Shh, you mustn't say anything about it yet, but I've made a great discovery." And Mrs. Stockman says, "What, again?"
Yes. Well, she's long suffering, certainly. And I think they're going to be more suffering if he sticks with it. But am I right, do you think, in that interpretation of Ostermeyer's ending, that there is some suggestion that he might compromise?
Well, that's what I was going to go on to say. So his response to her in the original is, "Yes, I have. I've made a great discovery." He gathers them around and he says, "The thing is, you see, that the strongest man in the world is the man who stands alone." Now, that's one of the most famous lines of this play, and it doesn't work in either the Herzog or the Ostermeyer ending if they're both going for something more equivocating, perhaps, on the part of Stockman, and that he's shaken by his experience. Whereas here, we've got a Stockman who, in the original, is absolutely, "Nope, I'm absolutely not budging."
He's bullish and maybe foolhardy, but he's not budging.
Yeah, and his wife is tearing her hair out, saying, "What, another discovery?" If only he would discover that he needs to make some compromises, is what she possibly is thinking.
Is it a sign of our times that we just don't believe that this hero is likely to prevail and that he's more likely to accept compromise? Or does everyone have a price?
He talked himself about, he vilified expediency, the idea that, well, this is going back to the press and his feelings about the way politicians, in his view, get out of a tight place by changing their affiliations or their views or modifying their positions just in the name of expediency. And he detested that. And he says that both in letters and in the play, actually. I think that's where Ibsen is saying in this original ending, that would completely be alien to the play to end it with any sense of compromise, in any sense that he might be giving in to those forces that are so compelling and so present in our lives that it's easy to give in to them. So I think maybe it's a part of why he turns around in The Wild Duck and says, maybe we have to think about this figure of the idealist a bit more, because Stockman is such an idealist.
He is, but Ibsen certainly intends that he stand up, that he doesn't want to leave the crimes, so-called, of the establishment unchallenged. The mayor who's preserved his power by covering up the truth, and the media who claim to speak for the public good but aren't above financial blackmail. We've left a little detail out there, but they basically want to sell themselves out as well to get the doctor to change his statement so that they also participate in the increased value of the shares. And actually, even more, that the majority have failed because they will continue to live with the poison waters and their effect, right? They've been duped by their corrupt leaders. They voted for, in a sense, to continue to poison themselves in an act of blind self-destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the spirit of this question of what about these two productions now and how they change the end, you have to imagine perhaps that if they're going to tamper with that speech of Stockman's to the point where, at least in the Ostermeyer, the audience is rooting for Stockman, that's completely 100% flipped. The townspeople are against Stockman. We're actually, in the Ostermeyer, they've opened the mics onto us, so we're the townspeople.
So just make clear, what happens in Ostermeyer's, this is giving away something if you haven't seen it already, but what happens is that they open up the house lights after the doctor has launched his tirade against the ills of our present time. He refers to the NHS and cost of living crisis and all sorts, and also attacks the general public for accepting all of the failures of our age. And then they open the house lights and ask us all, what do we think about what the doctor's just said? Now, it's a clever device in the sense that it replicates the public meeting. We are the public in the meeting in the original play. And then, as you say, literally, we end up with some question time type exchanges where people are handed mics and volunteer to speak. And it is what democracy is. It's a complete mess. They're just individuals saying whatever it happens to be their personal rage or grievance. And I don't know what the purpose of it is other than to say this is what democracy is. And maybe it's trying to say Ibsen had a point.
Yeah, there are two issues with it too, is that it's risky from the theatrical point of view, but also it compromises the clear, I usually don't use the term message, but there's really a message in his speech, isn't there, in the original? It compromises that. So everything is muddied. And what happens is, because you have a star, Matt Smith, playing Stockman, the audience is already on his side. They're rooting for Matt Smith. And so by the end, everyone's cheering Matt Smith on. And at the end of the original play, we're supposed to think that he's the enemy of the people. So to me, it felt they were at odds.
Interesting, because, of course, in the play, the public are against him. And in this production, his tirade against the ills of our age, a lot of it rings true, and a lot of it we buy into. So there were cheers from the audience, except for the bit where he attacks all of us. And so it reverses, as you say, the perspective of the audience to some degree. But it also makes it pretty complex because it does show us his questionable attitudes, and it also shows us how messy all these issues can be and public opinion can be. But you're right, he's not as obviously an enemy of the people.
Yeah.
But we as an audience watching Ibsen's play, we're rooting for Stockman.
Well, okay, that's an interesting one. Are we though?
I think we are really. Surely we're rooting for the truth teller.
Douglas, you're willing to look past the eugenics, the snobbishness, the elitism.
I'm not, no. Whoa. Not every element of what he says. I'm saying that we're rooting for the truth teller. We're not subscribing to all of his politics.
But that's the point. Ibsen's saying you can't weed those things out. You can't just take the bits of people that you like and leave out the parts, this is really complicated. This is why we keep returning to Ibsen, I think, in my very humble opinion. There's this constant way in which he keeps being renewed for our time, and that is one of them, the way in which he makes us face some things that are pretty uncomfortable, but they stand up. We haven't solved them. And one of the things about Ibsen was, I think he often was delighted with this reputation that he was somebody who posed questions, but his plays didn't provide answers. So they do leave you hanging a bit. I mean, the end of Enemy of the People, I can imagine some people thinking, okay, where's Act 6?
Yes.
Because, well, what happens? What does happen? And very often he blindsided people. So end of A Doll's House, she slams the door. Okay, where's the final resolution? We need the resolution. People were really stunned that he didn't give you, okay, here's what happens to Nora. And so there's this way in which we have to do some work ourselves by filling in those blanks. And it's hard.
I love the fact that we've come to the end here and we haven't reached any resolution, just as Ibsen would recommend, I'm sure, and that we spent an hour and a half at it or thereabouts and enjoyed every step of it.
And hopefully we've really disagreed, and that would be the spirit of the play.
Exactly. Thank you, Kirsten, so much for coming back for more of Ibsen. Before I let you go, I'll just remind you that one of the traditions of the podcast is I like to ask my guest to recommend a play that we could cover in the future episode or the one that's a personal favorite. And last time you recommended Wit by Margaret Edson, which we've put on our list on our website. Have you got another one you could volunteer for our listeners?
I do. And I'm afraid to say it's another Ibsen play.
Oh, no, that's allowed.
So I've chosen The Lady from the Sea.
Ooh. Why have you chosen that?
Well, I think that it is in the same spirit of being incredibly relevant to now. It's a play that's extraordinary, and I'm always surprised it hasn't had its moment yet in terms of reaching the popularity of A Doll's House or Ghosts or any of the others that we often see. But The Lady from the Sea, I saw a production with Natasha Richardson in 2003. And to give you a sense of it, it's a young woman she has a kind of deep love of the sea. She's so anchored in water. So he's exploring our evolutionary roots. He's thinking about all kinds of aspects of evolution, like adaptation or natural selection. But the most important thing about it, to my mind, is the discussion of marriage. It's a play that I would argue even more than any of the other plays that he's more famous for with Anglophone audiences. The Lady from the Sea gets to the heart of the issue of marriage and women's choice within marriage. And this is 1888, but he is absolutely feeling the pulse of the moment. And it's really radical. And you can see how even today, this would be a really fascinating thing for people to see and debate in terms of the institution of marriage and where it fits in society. So he's asking questions, again, that he doesn't resolve, but he puts them out there because he knows they're on people's minds.
Wonderful. It sounds a great choice and one that we'll come back to, definitely, and probably come back to you, Kirsten.
It would be a pleasure.
Look out for that invitation. Thank you very much for today. It's been great to talk to you again. Fascinating play. An Enemy of the People continues at the Duke of York's Theatre in London's West End until the 6th of April, 2024, and at the Circle in the Square Theatre in New York from the 27th of February to the 16th of June. Shall we organize to go see that one, Kirsten?
Yeah, that would be great, Douglas. Thank you.
Okay. I wish I could. If you'd like some more Ibsen, you're also welcome to listen to 2 more episodes of our podcast on Ghosts on episode 75 with Kirsten and A Doll's House in our very first episode with Dan Rebellato, and more Ibsen will follow. As the curtain falls on the doctor's beleaguered family, how do we rate the prospects for his fight for truth with the authorities, the press, and the public arraigned against him? As Mrs. Stockman says, what use is being right if you have no power? Perhaps the cynicism of our doubtful and contentious age makes his idealistic vision look unlikely. But surely we must believe that truth will out, and that a single voice like Dr. Stockman's, or say Greta Thunberg, can be heard. That more will follow, and the minority will become the majority. We just have to imagine. Thanks for listening. See you next time. there are additional footnotes about this and every other play that we cover in the podcast available to our patrons. Patrons also enjoy early access to our sister podcast, The Play Review, in which Jody Rylett and I share our views on current productions on the London stage. To become a patron, please visit our website at theplaypodcast.com. And don't forget to follow us wherever you listen to podcasts so as not to miss an episode. Thank you again for listening. See you next time.